Thank you for dialing in. I hope there's something here today in the live panel that will help you see extreme weather in a different sense, if you like. So welcome to the 5th live panel of 2025 with the Situation Room. It's part of a series that's running every month throughout the year, and wherever you're joining us from in the world, we hope there's something useful for you. It's a thought leadership forum, the Situation Room, if you haven't seen it before. So it's all about engagement. So today's your chance to ask our panel of experts questions that you've always wanted to know about extreme weather, about whether we're too complacent or whether we're too risk averse, if you like. But we'll get into that in a second. There's been an article running on the Situation Room on extreme weather since the start of the month, and it's a chance today to delve a bit deeper into some of the thoughts that were on that article, which was on LinkedIn or on our Better Mode platform as well. Now, if you've got any questions, pop them in the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can. Just pop your question in there and we'll ask the panel. If we run out of time, though, we'll answer those on the platform itself. So this runs throughout the year. It will stay there. All the comments we get will come up there as well. So we'll aim to answer those afterwards if we don't get to them today. Now, our focus today, as you probably guessed, is this extreme weather crisis that is quite a significant event for people around the world. The question today is, are we being too cautious or are we becoming dangerously complacent? Now, joining me today to delve into this subject is Harris Switman from the Montrose Environmental Group, one of our excellent partners. He's our associate consultant focusing on water, climate, and environmental sustainability. We've also got Robin Blanford from D4H Crisis Management. Robin's now Eco Online, part of our group here. He was the founder of D4H and the CEO. So he's been a busy man in the last month or so as we've been traveling the world and meeting new Eco Online customers. We've also got Dr. Richard Chipper. Richard is from Eco Online. He's our Chief Scientific Officer and a huge wealth of experience in the world of extreme weather over the years. I'm David Picton. I'm the Senior VP of Safety and Sustainability, also from Eco Online, and I'll be your host today. So, extreme weather. What used to be an unprecedented weather events have actually become, quite ironically and sadly, quite commonplace. Flash floods, historic heat waves, record-breaking storms. Lives sadly are lost. People and businesses incur major disruption and massive financial costs, and significant damage is caused to the environment. So as weather forecasts become ever more accurate, we can, of course, see some of this coming and take precautions, hopefully. Shutting down schools, for example, transport, factories and shops. Now, sometimes that proves wise, protecting people and organisations from the worst impacts, but sometimes those closures themselves actually cause massive disruption too, of course, and it's rarely an easy choice of which way to go. Now, if the weather doesn't turn out to be as bad as feared after one of those closures, then those measures can cause unnecessary financial losses and create even potentially a sense of crying wolf or overreacting. And we're even hearing the phrase alert fatigue as people become perhaps complacent and over time. Now, of course, if you look at the news just today, we had more sad news from Beijing with tragic loss of life in the floods. And earlier this month in July, we had the Texas situation with an extremely sad stories coming through from Texas. So extreme weather is arguably one of the most significant risks facing organizations and public bodies today. Now, a global professional services firm, Aon, have said that the economic losses from extreme weather events broke records in the first quarter alone of 2025, exceeding $83 billion. In a recent Morgan Stanley report, 57% of global executives reported that their companies have experienced climate-related events that impacted operations in the past year, and the most common being things like extreme heat or weather or storms. And specific business impacts, of course, are operational costs, workforce disruptions, loss of revenue, supply chain failures. So it's a significant issue, really, and so much so that the British Standards Institution, BSI, a global business standards company, has actually released a new ISO standard, believe it or not, to help cities respond to extreme weather events. So it's clearly something that we need to take seriously, but how seriously should we take it and how should we plan for it? So there's been a lot more call, if you like, for that proactive response to crisis, emergency management, and we've got a lot of crisis and emergency management expertise in Robin on the call today. But equally, those calls for business not to become too cautious and too risk averse, there's questions of whether the cure could be worse than the disease. So as you see, that's the sort of setup. There's no easy answer. There's a left and a right, an up and a down, a right and a wrong. Let's delve into some of that with our panel today then. So, to our headline question, what evidence have we seen that organizations are being too cautious or or we think that they're becoming dangerously complacent. I'm going to ask Robin first his views on that. Robin.
Yeah, thanks, David. So I think the thing that we're seeing is a complete polarization here. We've got some organizations sitting way in the overreact side, and we've got others in the completely underprepare side. And if you were to look at why that is, I think it falls into not having an escalation matrix. They're not sure what to do. They're not sure how to react. This leads to the two things. One is that they overreact, and the other is that, and there's a full sort of unnecessary full mobilization of everything. And on the other side, there's the forgetting to react, that maybe we don't need to this time. Organizations need to have a written escalation policy. There needs to be triggers. There needs to be gates it goes through that triggers the next stage. And when that happens, and when it happens on a recurring basis, people kind of understand and get to read the system. They get to understand how it's escalating up and know how to react. The complacency side comes mainly from not running drills, not running simulations, not doing post-incident reviews. And that then causes organizations not to review what they should have done or should do the next time.
Brilliant. That's really helpful, actually, Robin. Thanks. That the idea of learning really and practice ahead of time, really, knowledge being power. I think that's a great perspective. Thank you for that. Harris, turning to you then, same question really. So, what evidence have you seen, perhaps, that organisations are being too cautious about the weather, or maybe becoming complacent?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the idea of organizations being overly cautious is actually a symptom of them potentially being too complacent or failing to act in a manner that kind of puts preparedness first. And thinking through the scenarios, in my experience, I've done a lot of work on kind of climate change adaptation and resiliency. And in that case, organizations are really good at looking at the most recent weather events that they've experienced. So be it a flood, or a hailstorm or wildfires. I remember when I first started working on these issues about 15, 20 years ago, the concept of wildfires and wildfire smoke impacting communities was a very abstract thing for people. And I think, municipalities I was working with had a really hard time understanding what that looked like. I think now we see what that is, and we understand the idea of, near urban and interface fires and what that really looks like. And you can make that analogy when it comes to hail, extreme storms that might not occur at the same time of year that they've always occurred. Point being, there's a whole range of scenarios that you could think about, and that climate science really presents us. And I think organizations not being able to think through those scenarios in advance is really what leads to this idea of them being kind of overly reactive, and when something does happen, not really knowing what to do, and kind of scrambling, taking analogies from other events as opposed to thinking through the nuances that might need to be required when you're looking at one type of extreme weather versus another, instead of just reacting in the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. I think I like that idea of thinking it through in advance as well. The fact that this is a reality, as you say, and there's plenty of evidence around to see that now. So thinking it through in advance, very much, hopefully moving away from that extremes of reaction. Brilliant, thank you. Same question for you, Richard. Actually, the evidence that you've seen that organisations are perhaps too cautious or dangerously complacent.
Yeah, I think it's something that we're all aware of, and I know that in the UK Meteorological Office has really tried to, think carefully about how it sends out extreme weather alerts, and tries to temper the messages in order not to get kind of cry wolf scenarios happening. And I think it has commissioned some research of its own to look into that, the danger of that happening. I think, broadly, we are seeing some improvement. So I'd say on the good side is I know that sometimes reacting in a cautious way can avoid quite a bit of disruption. I'm thinking particularly of the transport services. And I know that here in Scotland, we now have a sort of policy where rather than waiting, sort of sending trains off in potentially hazardous conditions, they tend to cancel them so that they don't have to be then retrieved and block up the system for the future. So it does, although it does cause perhaps more frequent disruption, it allows the system to recover more quickly afterwards. So I think that's quite an interesting system where that does seem to be working. Where I came across examples of where over alerts are generally causing a problem, I've come across work in the health service actually, where a lot of automated systems throw up alerts for doctors to check things, and so many alerts sometimes get thrown up by the systems that people just kind of rush through the tick boxes. And if you've got a whole set of things, a clinician maybe gets fatigued and just ticks off things that, having seen many of them that are perhaps superfluous or unnecessary, and then they miss the one that's really important. So I think there is a genuine need for the systems themselves to be constantly maintained and to ensure that they're not throwing up too many false positive bugs. So I think, those are my kind of initial feelings on the system.
Yeah, exactly. As you say, the technology is fine, but those false positives actually can breed that sort of complacency piece if it's not helpful. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thanks for that. So turning to the next question, really, thanks, Robin. Just back to you, I think. At what point do we think that the economic costs of widespread sort of preemptive shutdowns outweigh the potential risks?
Yeah, I mean, look, all these risks have to be operationalized. This all comes down to what's flexible, what's non-negotiable, what can we keep running. And I think really the realization here is that this is the new reality. We take it operating your trains as an example. There are trains operating all over the world in the same conditions that we would have complete shutdowns in the UK and Ireland for, and coming from a new changing climate. It's the same thing. There's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing, right? There is the ability out there to operate your service in all sorts of conditions. It's just around preparedness. It's just around reinvestment into it. In terms of the shutdown costs, these losses are from panic decision making. They should be predetermined things. They should be pre-plans people are following. It should be acting on data. And hitting, as I said earlier, hitting through gates and knowing this is what we do when, having thought it through.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robin. Richard, I wonder if I could turn to you for the same question, really. At what point the economic costs, if you like, of widespread preemptive shutdowns actually outweigh the potential risks? Is there a balance?
Well, I think what my thought on that is what happens if we need to also consider investment in resilience, because as climate change progresses, and it's not going to be a linear affair, we will have periods, but basically what we're likely to have is ramping up of both the frequency and the severity of these adverse events. And we know it's not absolutely linear, so that it will affect certain parts of the world, sort of some degree of randomness over time. And I think if we don't invest in resilience, and by that I mean, both it's the systems, but it's also maybe hard things like infrastructure, or it's maybe nature-based solutions and other things, then what we will do is we'll increasingly get these kind of disruption alerts coming, and I think the cost of when these alerts get triggered are really a combination of the damage that actually occurs from the incident itself, plus the disruption all around it, from people taking sort of damage limitation or safety sort of actions. So I think it's difficult to separate those and say one is more than the other. That the overall effect is the combination of the frequency, the severity, and our reaction to that. So I think, I think we need to be very mindful of the amount that we need to start as society investing in this resilience packages.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually, really. So that takes us on to my next question, I think, really. And Harris, just to turn to you, what evidence have you seen, perhaps, of organisations doing this conscious evaluation of extreme weather risks and perhaps potentially making those investments ahead of time, or are they still largely just reacting after the fact?
My perception is that I think that the idea of preparedness and resilience is gaining a lot more traction than maybe it had, 5 or 10 years ago. Unfortunately, it takes a good crisis sometimes for people to galvanize the energy and passion to do what might be needed. And I think, unfortunately, we've had a lot of those around the world recently. Some of the examples for me that really stand out, and obviously there's lots and lots of them, but just from the ones that I've kind of been a little bit more aware of, is on the infrastructure side of things. I think you're starting to see capital projects where you've got, infrastructure and assets that have a very long lifespan, right? 50 to 100 years, let's say, bridges, transit, runways at airports, port infrastructure, rail infrastructure, even, buildings, new buildings, particularly those that are trying to be a little bit lower on their carbon footprint, really looking at things like energy systems as well, and how do we make those more resilient. And I think you're starting to see design guidelines being built into a lot more of the infrastructure design process, and frameworks that organizations are following. So things like LEED and Envision for certifying your infrastructure, from a sustainability standpoint, are increasingly focused on resiliency and climate and natural hazard resiliency. And just from my own experience being in the field, I've seen a lot more interest and demand for the focus in these areas. There's been a lot more kind of webinars and speaking engagements where the focus within those tools is really on resilience and people grappling with what does this mean and how can we make this real within our infrastructure and our project. The other thing that I've seen, which I find really interesting, is, at least here in Canada, a municipality is starting to really grapple with the idea of kind of multiple hazard scenarios and trying to manage multiple climate or extreme weather related risks sort of within the same project. We used to see things like, all right, let's build a flood wall. But instead we're seeing, let's build infrastructure that can be really great at protecting the community from flooding, but at times when there's a drought, maybe this can also be a refuge for a cooling space within the community. I've also seen a project recently that one of the municipalities is working on where they're trying to look at cooling spray parks that they added a number of years ago to their parks in order to be a cooling sort of refuge during extreme heat events. And now they're saying, oh, one of our big realities is drought and water supply issues. So how can we make these cooling facilities lower water, lower in their water use? How can we increase their intensity of water use? So I think, and even municipalities starting to get into the space of thinking creatively about how can we support our communities with losses related to things like hail damage and uninsured hail damage, and how can we do things preventatively, whether it's working with the insurance companies and doing programs like, preventative hail seeding when you've got an imminent hailstorm coming, to get those, get the moisture and start creating smaller amounts of hail as opposed to giant, golf ball size pieces falling down on people's houses. So I think organizations are starting to see that they have a wide variety of roles to play in this space. And honestly, I think that the opportunity is endless, right? Organizations can be creative, they can collaborate, and they can really start to think beyond their typical roles and figuring out what role can we play, what value can we add to the broader community when it comes to resiliency. That takes some creativity and thinking outside the box, but I do think that, at least here in Canada, and I think in a lot of smaller countries that are facing risks related to sea level rise, we're starting to see some really creative thinking around this.
Yeah,
and I think that that's something to be optimistic about.
Yeah, and certainly in the whole system view, I think that's really helpful. Thank you. And I guess, Robin, just turning to you, same question really, because I mean, you are seeing a lot of, especially with everything you've been doing with D4H over the years, organisations constantly evaluating and consciously do this to make investments over time. Are you seeing that evidence?
Yeah, I think, as just said, there's normally a triggering event. Now, what we've seen is the triggering event moved from just being a large crisis or incident to being a compounding crisis. And so what we've seen in the last really, I'll call it 2 to 3 years with climate change, is the last incident hasn't been mopped up yet. There is still fallout, there's still recovery going on, and the next one hits, and the next one hits, and they're starting to compound. And those incidents are therefore becoming more and more complex. And as they compound, that's when everything falls apart. You need a structured response. You need to have clean audit trails of what happened, after action reviews. How are you following through a consistent response every time and improving for the next one? And all that just falls apart when they start compounding. On top of that, organizations are getting hit with lots of other things. Cyber attacks are a whole new world. When you take systems out and then have a storm hit, people end up in a really bad situation. So they're typically the bits we're seeing around that. It is reactive. It's rarely investing ahead. But if it is investing ahead, it's because they see a competitive advantage in doing so.
Brilliant. That's really helpful. Thanks. And I think that that gives us this idea of seeing ESG, sustainability, if you like, as a much more rounded issue than just perhaps greenhouse gas accounting or the environment, because as you say, rightly so, but cybersecurity systems, very important part of governance and making sure you've got that resilience there. Great question, actually, that's come in from the audience, really, which gives us a chance, Richard, just to turn to you and say that when we look at some of these obvious impacts of extreme weather, so what should organizations do perhaps to think beyond those impacts and to some of the knock-on effects and implications, if you like, beyond the obvious?
Well, I think, the obvious thing is to think about, immediately keeping people safe and secure and, getting them home safely and all that kind of thing. Shutting work plant down and that kind of thing, and being able to start it up safely. I think, we should also start thinking and need to consider some of the broader sort of effect on morale of people, maybe the effect on supply chains and the broader sort of business continuity effects, potentially, particularly in the food and drink space, those things, severe incidents can have an effect on product quality that can be quite long lasting. And so what to do about those? So, I think you've got a sort of long trail of impacts as well as the immediate ones that you have to deal with as a sort of emergency. You've then got these kind of broader issues that you have to think in a business sense about how you'll deal with them. Interesting, I would say a lot of it, businesses have gone through economic crises seems like every 5 years or so, and we barely recover from one, and another one seems to start some sort or other. And in some ways, I think the lessons from those things, can translate across to these physical impact things. And obviously, and the economy is dealing with a combination of these things, sort of spread around. It seems to be the new reality.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for that. So, Harris, I wonder if we could ask you the same sort of question. What should organizations do to think beyond the obvious impacts of extreme weather to some of those knock-on effects and implications?
Yeah, I think about this in terms of the fact that a given organization's impacts or, from an extreme weather event, the more indirect ones are actually the result or related to another party's risks or another party's impacts, and within the environment, within the broader community or the space that everyone's operating in. I think, COVID was a really good example of some of the unintended impacts that we saw in relation to things like supply chains, right? Where, you don't necessarily think that by restricting labor or restricting kind of operating conditions in one part of the world or one country, that you're affecting a supply chain and the ability of somebody to operate on the whole other side of the country or part of the world. And I think the same thing goes when it comes to extreme weather at a bit of a different scale, potentially, right? And so, when you look at, for instance, a given response, I think to a let's call it a flood or some sort of major event, people are looking to the government, they're looking to municipalities, emergency response personnel, obviously, right, in the immediate effect to try and mitigate and deal with the situation and respond, which is really their role. But I think very quickly what you'll start to see is that if you're not able to think about, and if those organizations aren't able to take a leadership role and a coordinating role, and organizations themselves aren't able to take a leadership role in understanding, like, where is our exposure within the broader community? Who are we dependent on? Who depends on us? And really understanding that community level interaction between organizations and how that plays into crisis or extreme weather impact. I think that's really critical, is understanding the relationships that you have and the dependencies that you have within the community and within your supply chain if you're a business before an event happens, so that you're not scrambling after the fact. And then what can they do about it? I think obviously understanding where those relationships and dependencies are, but I think as well thinking then through how can we build in some simple principles around resilience, modularity. How can we have kind of modular supply chains or operations? How can we have additional redundancy built into our operations or our business? And how can we really start to think about relying on alternatives and being flexible, right? And I think this gets back to one of your original questions, which was like, are we too, reactive, right? And I think if you can think about all of the different ways you can be flexible in a given situation, that'll present, a range of options. But I think, really, if organizations can think about who are their dependencies and who's dependent on them, how can they sort of have multiple options if one of those pillars goes down, and then how can they build additional flexibility into their operation and kind of modularity. I think those are some really important aspects.
Really helpful. Thanks. Like you said, that flexibility and dependencies. I like that. That's that idea of going beyond the initial and obvious effects and impacts. Robin, one for you actually, really, when we look at the idea that we are making improvements in forecasting accuracy and some regional relevance, but with what you know about crisis management and everything, how could that improvement perhaps help organizations with their crisis response?
Yeah, so the big thing we've seen is sites moving from real-time weather, and that's real-time rain radar. They put sensors on their infrastructure, so they're tracking road temperatures or surface temperatures. They're tracking wind speeds. And they've got limits when these things go over. Close the bridge or do something, or close the ride at the amusement park, whatever it might be. Right, that's moving into predictive stuff. And so what they're getting now is, on Wednesday you'll be closing this at 3 p.m. And it's starting to become far more predictive with better and better data. That's coming from better satellite coverage, better private companies moving into weather forecasting. Previously, everything relied on public infrastructure in space to get us this data, and that was the best we could do. So that's one of the pieces. The other piece is turning these forecasts into actionable data, and so we don't actually need to know that there'll be so many milliliters of rain at this, or millimeters of rain at this time. The interesting thing is, what do I do when I get that? So this means we turn these measurements and these readings into triggers that say, close this, do this, take cover. Workers need to move out of the heat. It's actual triggering actions for the organization based on what's coming. And we see that on a larger and larger scale, where the very high-end organizations are moving fleet around, moving projects around, moving everything's getting out ahead of the weather. There's some very interesting stuff going on around road conditions, delivery, logistics, transportation, where cargo is being routed around weather systems in advance. Yeah, very, very interesting stuff, giving a huge competitive advantage.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing from that particularly is organizations making effectively sort of data-driven decisions really there, and then they might be starting off from a compliance perspective. So they have, compliance data, but then they're moving that through maturity towards that ability to predict something and use learnings from the past.
Yeah, it's changing their operations. So they're operating as normal with adaptions because they're able to predict the weather instead of panic when everything gets backed up and stuck.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, well, actually, and yeah, that's really helpful thinking. I'll come back to your idea about no such thing as bad weather, just bad kit. And I've thought that myself many times out on the hills when I'm very thankful for having spent just a little bit extra on a decent set of waterproofs. What have you. Yeah. Good. Well, we're almost out of time, so I just want to pick up the last question, if I can, and ask all three of you really. We've looked at a lot of issues there and covered a lot in a very quick period of time really, but what do you see coming for the next issues and challenges presented by responding to the increasing frequency of extreme weather? So it's no doubt that it is getting worse, and it's definitely getting more frequent, and as you said, often compounded various issues. But so what do we see next for the issues and challenges presented by this increasing frequency? Robin, if I could start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I think the big thing here is resiliency, and resilience is going to become a key performance indicator for boards. This is becoming clear. There is an operational excellence, there is a competitive advantage to organizations who are rooting around this. They're not letting it impact them the same way as their competitors. And we're going to see that more and more, board level KPIs. The next piece is becoming far more fully integrated across compliance, across crisis, and across ESG. Unifying that readiness across an organization where it's one piece, one movement, one thing. And the final thing is, I think you're going to start seeing, not that it should be militaristic, but the military do things in certain ways because it's the most effective way. And in a crisis, this is quite similar. And I think we're seeing more and more coming out of public safety into private organizations where they're actually starting to hire emergency managers, not just a crisis manager for reputational and other pieces, but this is now an emergency manager who can handle these emergencies in the organization, write the pre-plans, write the documentation, and understands what is needed and when these things happen. So I think that they're the pieces that you're going to see next in this response.
Yeah, brilliant. I like that. As an ex-military man myself as well, many times said the phrase of training hard to fight easy. I think.
Yep. We talk all about organizations moving from their peacetime to wartime org chart. You don't want cross-functional marketing. You don't want cross-functional communications. The incident commander, the crisis director, they are in charge of that incident, and everything should flow with unity of command.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a really, really good concept, and something you will have seen many times in your experience. So thank you. Harris, just turning to you, same question really. What do you see coming next for the issues and challenges presented, as organizations respond to this increasing frequency of extreme weather?
So I think for me, the big challenge here, and I think we're at a place in our society where we really need to confront this piece head on, is that doing organizations that are really successful at being resilient and managing kind of extreme weather risk and responding effectively have an ability to think a bit longer term and bigger picture about what's coming at them, what's going to be coming at them, and really leveraging the information that's out there. And sometimes that requires making investments that are a bit longer term in nature, where you're not going to see immediate payback. I think we're in a time and a space right now, both politically and economically, where short-term gains and short-term sort of rewards are really driving a lot of decision making. And that I think is a big challenge when it comes to extreme weather. Some of this is going to take, continued investment in research, to improve forecasting and responsibilities and guidance and standards. And I think a lot of it is going to just take dedicated investment in longer term payback to prevent damages in the future. And I kind of worry that, one of the big challenges is that we're in an environment where, there's a lot of economic, hardship in the world right now. And I think people are increasingly focused on, how do I get through the next week? How do I get paycheck to paycheck? And that's a real issue. I think the challenge is for leaders and organizations to think about how do we support that, but how do we also do that long-term work to ensure that over time these issues don't get compounded by losses.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big kind of conflict, or not a conflict, but it's definitely a sort of a tension,
isn't it? Yeah.
That needs to be resolved, or people need to be conscious of.
Brilliant, really helpful. Thank you. And Richard, just turning to you for that last question, really, what do you see coming next for the issues and challenges in those responses?
I'd agree. Yes, thanks. I'd agree with all the above. I'd just add a couple of things. One is on the human capability side. I think there's a lot of investment and sort of some thought going to be needed into how we train people and how we prepare people emotionally and as groups to kind of respond in a positive way. Because I think often there's a tendency for things and the way we react to kind of generate sort of blame culture, and we need to kind of avoid that. And we need to build unity of response and sort of build up community spirit, resilient community spirit. And the other is, I think, which I'd like to see as an opportunity, which is, I think, not all, but a significant amount of adaptive and resilient measures could be addressed by investing in nature-based solutions, which will mitigate things like extreme rain flows, water flows across the surface, protecting soils from running off and causing landslides, using water catchments to conserve water in dry periods and to provide shade in extreme heat. So those kind of things seem to be quite promising and relatively lower cost. They obviously aren't a solution everywhere for all measures, but those are my two.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you. I mean, we are just about out of time, really. So we've covered an awful lot there. So thank you to the panel. Thank you to Richard. Thank you to Robin. Thank you to Harris for some excellent insights, really, and really bringing to life, obviously a very complex issue. There is no right or wrong answer, of course, on whether we're becoming too complacent or whether we're being overcautious, because it's about that balance. And you heard some great points there about escalation matrix, pointing out that the preparation, really, the investment in resilience, seeing multiple hazards perhaps compounding and coming together, really thinking through those dependencies as well. So whilst it might seem like weather is being done to us, or extreme weather just is something which happens to us, hopefully you've heard today many of the ways that organizations are looking ahead, planning ahead and investing ahead, and trying to make this something that they can manage and deal with as best they can, despite the circumstances. Of course, if there's anything more that's come out from this that we can help you with, or that we find useful to follow up on, please look at the Montrose website or our own website at Eco Online. We'd be more than happy to pick up and follow with you and try and delve into some of those issues in more detail, if that can help to keep your people safe, help you to deal with this crisis response, if you like, and do that investment in resilience that we've talked about. So thanks once again for joining us. Hope that was useful and helpful for you. Please do take a look at the Situation Room. There's more content coming every month. We're going to do a quick recap in August, which will pick up the 5 subjects we've done so far this year. And then there's an autumn calendar to come as well. So hopefully the Situation Room will be useful for you. Thanks again to the team, and thank you to you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.